it short here. There we go. It's fun to be among so many different people with so many different focuses that all sort of fit under the general umbrella term of freedom movement. So many people pointing out all sorts of different abuses of power, and so many people railing against political corruption. And there's certainly no shortage of examples of government misconduct or downright atrocities that deserve condemnation and deserve being resisted. But what I have to say today may rain on some people's parades. Because for all the destructive symptoms of authoritarian power, which all sorts of people here are righteously and rightfully complaining about, a whole lot of people, even here, still don't yet recognize the underlying cause. When people point out, for example, the ridiculous injustices that were carried out in the last couple of years in the US and around the world in the name of protecting people's health, when it had absolutely nothing to do with that, good, glad to hear it. That should be bashed. When people bash the open, ongoing warmongering and the corporate profiteering off of people dying all over the world completely needlessly, excellent. That should be condemned and criticized. That's utterly horrible. And I could go down the list of 100 more examples of the evils inflicted on humanity by an out-of-control government. But since you're already at PorkFest, you've probably already heard 100 different examples anyway, so I won't bother. But I'm here to be a bit of a party pooper instead by pointing out things like this. If you talk about an out-of-control government, that sort of implies that you think there could be some other type, like an under-control government. There can't be. When you complain about abuse of power, talking about the government, that implies that governmental power could, at least in theory, be used in some non-abusive way. It can't. When you object to political corruption, that implies that there could be some form of political power which is not corrupt. There isn't. So, a lot of us here can be on board when it comes to pointing out the various problems which political authority leads to, but make no mistake, we are not all on the same page when it comes to understanding the solution. And no, the enemy of my enemy is not automatically my friend or my ally. If you think that the enemy of your enemy must be your friend, then you probably need to read a history book. Because all of the worst tyrannies in history rose to power, usually cheered into power by adoring, excited, happy throngs in response to some other injustice. In the 1930s, the people of Germany had good reason to be frustrated and angry about injustices that they were forced to endure, including the Treaty of Versailles, among other things. Then along came someone who promised that if only he was given the reins of government, he would right those wrongs. So how did that turn out? In Russia, when Lenin, Stalin, and them came along and promised that if given political power to finally put an end to the horrible injustices which the czars had been inflicting on the Russian people for so long, how did that turn out? When Mao promised to use political power to deliver freedom and justice to the former victims of the Chinese feudal lords and the foreign imperialists coming in, how did that turn out? And to bring this closer to home, both literally and figuratively, after King George did all his stuff, like imposing tiny taxes on tea and pieces of paper, and a few other nasty things. And then we got the Declaration of Independence, and then later the U.S. Constitution. What was the outcome? Now, I consider the United States of America, with its glorious Constitution, the best attempt anywhere in the world at any point in history of creating a limited government with the purported purpose of protecting individual rights and serving the people. The best attempt ever to make that happen. How did it turn out? Whether you all like hearing this or not, the US Constitution created what would become the most powerful authoritarian empire the world has ever known, with the most powerful standing army, not just at home protecting us, but going all over the world and exerting violent control. And the Constitution created the biggest and most intrusive extortion racket the world has ever known, the IRS. And at this point, both state and federal government have their tentacles in damn near every aspect of everyone's lives, exerting a level of intrusion and domination into people's day-to-day lives that neither the Soviet Union, nor Red China, nor the Third Reich ever dreamed of. Controlling what you can eat, what you can drink, what you can smoke, what you can sell, what you can buy, where you can live, who you can hire, what you can build, what you can work for, and so on and so on, robbing you at every turn in the name of taxation whenever you earn a penny, or spend a penny, or just try to hang on to a penny. But hey, at least we don't have to pay a 4% tax on imported tea, am I right? So when I hear some new would-be political savior railing against the injustices of today and promising that if only they were given the ring of power, if only they are put on the throne, if only they were handed the reins of control, then they will end those injustices that all of us here are railing against, I say, no thanks. Actually, I usually say something else, but it's too rude to say in mixed company. The problem is that most people, having been raised to think like loyal and obedient subjects of a ruling class, also known as law-abiding taxpayers, can only think inside the paradigm of who should be on the proverbial throne. Americans are happy to forever bicker about how much they should all be robbed and in what manner, but the idea of not being robbed at all is beyond their comprehension or imagination. There's even a well-known saying that demonstrates this. The only two sure things in life are death and, yeah, ew. So when I tell the average American, I don't think anyone should rob you at all, I don't want you being forced to fund anything, which is why I oppose in principle the theft and extortion known as taxation, how do they usually respond? Well, I mean, government needs to be funded somehow so it can perform certain functions, which blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. Due to their indoctrination and lack of imagination, they literally argue against their own freedom and argue in favor of them and their children and everyone else they know and millions of people they don't know being continually robbed for the rest of their lives. They insist that a civilized society couldn't exist if we mere peasants weren't forcibly robbed and dominated by a parasitical ruling class. They, and by they I might also mean some of you, are scared of freedom, and they're still emotionally attached to the very idea that is the foundational cause of every single problem that everyone here at PorkFest is complaining about. And that underlying cause is the belief in authority and government in particular. They condemn the effects, that's easy, while still zealously supporting the cause of all of it. They complain about the symptoms, but they keep cheering for the underlying disease. So, doctor, can you remove my cancer? Well, I mean, you can't have no cancer. You just need a limited cancer, a cancer that serves you. You need the right amount of cancer and the right kind of cancer in the right place, doing the right thing. Otherwise, your whole system would turn into random chaos and you would die a horrible death. Why do people do this? Well, there's the indoctrination and the propaganda, of course, and being surrounded by other people who still believe in the divine right of politicians. But there's also a more devious and pernicious incentive for people to cling to these ideas. You see, if you accept the premise that it's okay and legitimate and moral to have your neighbors robbed and forcibly dominated if it's done by way of law and governmental authority, just think of all the great things that you could force onto the world. You could force equality and fairness, whatever the hell that means. You could force the evil rich to give to the worthy poor. You could force people to stop having whatever habits you don't approve of. You could force people to fund all the wonderful good things that you think the world needs. Yay, what could possibly go wrong? This week, a lot of people here are talking about the authoritarian injustices that they oppose. Good. Glad to hear it. But after you're done bragging about the ways in which you don't want me spied on and harassed and robbed and intimidated and assaulted and caged or killed by the political parasites and their thugs, and thank you for that, my next question is going to be, okay, well, which things do you want the state robbing me to fund? Which of my choices do you want decided for me by politicians and their armed enforcers? Now, for those of you who don't know, I'm one of those crazy extremist kooks who don't want you to be forced to fund anything. And if you're not victimizing someone else through violence and coercion and fraud, I don't want anyone ever using force against you. But I'm kind of a fringe weirdo kook that way. Here's the problem with most people who complain about political corruption, which is most people here. When someone else manages to use government force to serve their interests at your expense, you call it corruption. But if you can get political thugs to use the force of law to serve your interests at someone else's expense, then it's fun to call it good, democratic, representative government. It's still corruption. It's the same damn thing. It's just corruption that you benefit from, so you want to pretend that makes it good. It doesn't. Every single advocate of government is an advocate of political corruption. There is no other option. I'm going to say that again. Every advocate of any kind of government is an advocate of political corruption. The goal of every single voter is to be the beneficiary of immoral government violence instead of the victim of it. No one votes for freedom. That's never on the ballot. They just vote for a different flavor of injustice, which they hope will benefit them instead of someone else. For example, you can point to the last few years and how Big Pharma successfully got political parasites to inflict all manner of horrible, idiotic, insane injustices onto billions of people around the world in order to enrich and empower themselves. And you can righteously condemn and oppose that, as you should, and I will too. That was insane and evil and ridiculous. But if you then turn around and advocate something like universal basic income, for example, where government force is used to extort countless people that you don't know in a way that you prefer for an end that you want, if you call it abuse of power when you're on the losing side, but cheer for it when you're on the winning side, then you are an absolute hypocrite, and you are not one shred more moral than the lobbyists for Big Pharma. You're playing the same game. You're not against theft and thuggery. You just want to be the one receiving the stolen loot instead of the one being robbed. That doesn't make you virtuous or principled. It doesn't make you an advocate of freedom. Complaining about your own victimization while supporting the victimization of others doesn't make you noble. It makes you a fraud, a coward, and a hypocrite. Now, imagine that someone tries to rob you at gunpoint. And imagine that I happen to be there, and you and I fight him off. Yay, we're freedom fighters. We're allies, brothers in arms. And then the next day I turn around and I try to rob you at gunpoint, and you object and you say, wait, what was that yesterday when you were on my side? And my reply is, oh, well, that was Tuesday. Armed robbery on Tuesdays is a horrible thing, but now it's Wednesday. Armed robbery on Wednesdays is perfectly fine, so hand over your money. Am I still your ally? Am I still pro-freedom? Am I a freedom fighter? No. In that scenario, I'm an unprincipled hypocrite. Well, so is every single advocate of any government, of any kind, any flavor, any size, even if they zealously and rightfully oppose particular examples of authoritarian oppression while condoning others. And by the way, my somewhat harsh words here also apply to what I used to believe and advocate. Back when I was a statist many years ago, I would righteously proclaim that the political left had no right to forcibly extort me in the name of some bogus common good to fund some giant welfare state. And then I would turn right around and insist that all of them should be extorted for the common good to fund police and military. It was only when I finally recognized and accepted the obvious inherent hypocrisy and immorality of my own political position that I stopped being a cheerleader for political corruption. Now, to be clear, back when I believed in the heinous game of politics and I thought legitimate government was a thing, at least theoretically, I wasn't trying to be evil. I thought I was one of the good guys, cheering for good things. I could easily imagine malicious intention among those who wanted a different flavor of authoritarian collectivism, but I only wanted government to exist so it could be a force for truth, freedom, and justice. It's embarrassing to admit that now, but I bring it up because I need to make something clear. To those of you who still believe in government, if I assume there are some of those here, regardless of where you are on that spectrum, I don't think you're trying to be evil. I don't think you're all a bunch of despicable villains. I assume that you're all well-intentioned and decent people. Well, there might be a few psychos here, especially if there are any undercover feds hiding out here. But for the most part, I assume you mean well. But that brings up an interesting and uncomfortable point. When you watch old videos of those happy, excited throngs of people cheering as tyrants rose to power, who we now know did horrible things, what do you think of that? Do you think that everyone in Germany, a very technologically advanced and cultural and educated and civilized society, did they all suddenly become evil in the 1930s and all cheered to have evil things happen? And then since then, they all got good again, which is convenient. Were those huge crowds cheering Mao and the huge crowds cheering for Stalin, were they genuinely evil people looking forward to genocide and oppression? No. Many in those crowds ended up being victims of the very things they cheered into power. So, from our comfortable position today, let's be judgmental. Are you ready to condemn as evil, unforgivable monsters all those people who supported Stalin, who supported Mao, who supported Hitler? In a practical sense, those people absolutely helped to bring about horrendous injustice and mass murder. But is that what they were trying to do? No. If you want a perfect soundbite to take out of context, here it is. The people who cheered Hitler into power, the members of the Nazi Party, were mostly good people who meant well. There, cut that out of context and post it on YouTube. If that makes you uncomfortable, good. It should. It should creep you out. It should scare the crap out of you to realize that in many different places at many different times, huge numbers of well-intentioned, polite, caring, generous people zealously supported regimes that ended up committing heinous atrocities. Now, why do I bring that up here? Because While I don't think there are many malicious villains in the audience here today, or even in the audience that will eventually see this on YouTube, and while I assume that most of you are trying to do what you think is right, I also think that a lot of you continue to advocate things that absolutely result in the suffering and abuse of countless innocent people. Now, to be fair, I'm going to do something I've done before, which I hate doing, but I make myself do it, and that is admitting to the horrendous injustices that I unwittingly supported back when I was still a statist, 27 stinking years ago. Back when I still believed in government and law and order. By the way, I still believe in order, but I now recognize that governmental law is the arch enemy of actual civilized, moral, peaceful order. And tyrannical, authoritarian order is not a good thing. Once upon a time, over a quarter of a century ago, I was a big supporter of law enforcement. I even had the stickers on my car. Sure, I knew there was an occasional bad apple, but I thought that mostly law enforcement was about protecting and serving the people. Don't laugh. I also supported the military back during the Gulf War, America. And back in 1993, when I was hearing the mainstream media version of what was happening with the Branch Davidians outside of Waco, Texas, I was cheering for the feds to go in and stop that evil cult leader. Back in my 20s, living my sheltered little life, I even thought the war on drugs was mostly righteous and justified. Ugh. Like I said, I hate admitting this stupidity. Now, even back then, I wasn't really an idiot. I had a functioning brain. I wasn't evil, but I was profoundly misguided and indoctrinated. I bring this up today because I'm not here to question your good intentions. I'm not here to tell you you're bad people. And I'm not questioning how much you care. I'm not questioning how sincere you are about your beliefs. I'm here to challenge you with this question. Are your intentions good enough that you dare to carefully re-examine what you yourself are advocating? Does truth and justice matter enough to you that if you were misguided and accidentally cheering for evil, that you'd want to know about it and that you'd be able to objectively reconsider things? And as it happens, there's a nice little test for that, to see whether somebody's good intentions matter to them more than whatever beliefs they may be attached to today. And that is that person willing to look at the specific real-world consequences of what he is cheering for? Today we can argue about how much the average German really knew about what was going on under the Third Reich. I'm sure there was some degree of accidental ignorance, and it's not like they had the internet to spread things around or cell phones everywhere. But was there also a degree of willful ignorance? In other words, people kind of trying to not face and acknowledge the full reality of what was going on. Now, a modern example might be Americans who go, rah, rah, for the U.S. military. Thank you for your service. And when yet another video comes to light showing U.S. soldiers being psychotic murderers, who do those Americans get mad at? Those who committed the atrocity, or the traitors who endangered national security by exposing the atrocities? That is a pretty good indicator of just how good someone's intentions really are. Now, that also applies to those who back the men and women in blue, which used to be me. And when yet another video surfaces showing badge wearers being sadistic sociopaths, do they acknowledge and condemn that evil, or do they flounder around and tap dance and make excuses and then try to dig up dirt on whomever the cops were abusing that day? Now, I don't have the time or the right to personally interrogate each one of you to test your good intentions, but I do have something that I will invite you to do on your own. In fact, I challenge you to do this. In fact, I dare you to do this. You don't even have to do it in front of anybody else. You get to be the judge and the jury. Write down, if you still believe in government, write down your top 5 or 6 things that you want government to do. And then literally and specifically describe what you personally want to be done to anyone who doesn't go along with the government agenda that you advocate. I mean, sounds simple enough, doesn't it? No vague euphemisms and mush and fluffy rhetoric. Just admit the exact reality of what you want. I mean, if you can't even describe what you advocate in blunt, precise language, what does that tell you? I'll give you a few examples so you know what I'm talking about. If you support government welfare, for example, to help the poor, where does that money come from? Taxation, which is just a euphemism for ongoing extortion. So, for example, if you want free health care or some such thing, because you're such a caring, generous, kind of person, what I'm asking now is just that you plainly and honestly admit the specifics of what you want to have happen to make that a reality. If someone, for whatever reason, doesn't want to fund a government wealth redistribution scheme, what do you want to be done to that person? Because, yeah, you can focus on the government giving. They have to get it somewhere first. What do you want to be done to someone who says, I don't want to be part of that contribution, quote unquote? Would you let people decide for themselves if they want to support it? Or do you want millions of people you don't know to be forced to support it, whether they want it or not? And if you do want them forced, get into detail. Again, in private, in your own head. I'm not even asking you to tell me. Do you want someone put in a cage if they don't fund the generous, caring government programs you support? As someone who's been in a cage for a year for not complying with the IRS, I can tell you that is the reality of what happens. And however compassionate you claim to be in the things you want government funding to go to, is that what you wanted? And every once in a while I'll guilt trip somebody because I'll talk about my own adventures with the IRS and how I ended up in a cage for 15 years and robbed into poverty in a hole I'm still trying to climb out of. And they'll say, I'm so sorry that happened to you. And if they're a Democrat or a Republican, I say, why? I mean, you voted for people who you knew were going to implement and enforce a tax policy that would do exactly this to people who disobey. Why aren't you happy about it? Like, you knew they were going to do that, right? You knew they weren't just asking nicely. Why do you feel bad about it? But that shows the conflict where they don't really want to look at the violence they condone, because that makes them recognize, that's not really what I believe in. It's not really what I want. So I challenge you to do the same. As another example, if you think we need a big military to defend us from scary people on the other side of the world, which would also be funded by taxation, what do you want to be done to anybody who doesn't fund that? You're going to ask nicely and let them go on their merry way if they don't pay up? Or do you personally advocate something worse be done to that person? And it's not just about funding things. As another example, if you support reasonable gun control laws, or any gun control laws, well, I think machine guns need to be outlawed, but these assault weapons ban, whatever it is, what do you want to be done to someone who disobeys? What is it that you personally advocate? For example, if you believe in an assault weapons ban, and I decide I'm not giving up my AR-15, which, by the way, I'm not giving up my AR-15, what do you think should be done to me? Never harmed anyone, never threatened anyone. If you're advocating that men with guns come take me hostage if I refuse to be disarmed and maybe kill me if I resist, kind of gets hard for you to pretend that you're against gun violence, doesn't it? And the list goes on and on, whether it's border controls or the war on drugs or laws and regulations about 1,000 other things. Whatever you want government controlling, all I'm asking right now is that you admit, even if just to yourself in the privacy of your own thoughts, the physical reality of what it is that you want to be done to other real human beings in the real world if you had your ideal government, if it did exactly what you wanted it to do. Statism, the belief in government and political authority, will someday be viewed with the same contempt and condemnation as chattel slavery is now viewed. And one of the main reasons for that is more and more people are becoming more honest with themselves about what it is they're actually supporting. And once you see and admit the immoral violence that is behind every law that every advocate of government supports, a whole lot of people get very uncomfortable with what they've always assumed. Just seeing the reality of what government is, a gang of violent, immoral parasites, makes decent people cringe and start to think twice, which is why most people don't want to look at it closely. All of the euphemisms and propaganda and rhetoric, like every word out of every politician's mouth, we just need to help the less fortunate. It's all designed to hide the fact that governments are ruling classes and everything they do is by way of coercion and violence. All the BS we're taught about representative republics and servant governments and how democracy is the same as freedom, if you dare to look closely, all of that mythology completely falls apart. And as technology allows us mere peasants to communicate a million times more easily and takes away the ability of the ruling classes to control all thought and discourse, ideas that don't actually make sense, like everything about statism, tend to slowly fall apart, even if it takes a while. When people stopped believing in the silly divine right of kings idea, the would-be parasites and tyrants had to make up more elaborate excuses for why they should still be allowed to forcibly dominate and exploit everybody else. Saying that some watery tart had lobbed a scimitar at you and therefore you're king didn't really sound convincing anymore, so they came up with much more involved and elaborate excuses to try to justify the subjugation of humanity. But it's not a ruling class, it works for us. We're allowed to vote, and we have a constitution with a Bill of Rights, and this is a representative republic, so the people are in charge. You just need to vote for the right people, and then blah, blah, blah. Oh, by the way, if you haven't read my book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, do. I'm going to spring a surprise question on all of you right now, not even knowing how many people this applies to, and I want you to be honest. Who here, by a show of hands, actually thinks there's the slightest chance in hell that voting will ever undo the authoritarian monstrosity that we see and create an actually free country? One hand. I admire your delusion. I mean optimism. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. Whether we want to admit it or not, even to ourselves, I think the vast majority of us know there is no political solution. Your vote doesn't stinking matter, and it never will. Those in power don't give a crap what you want and are never going to. Every once in a while, there's a little temporary thing. Well, over here, we got a little bit repealed. You're still being robbed of most of your paycheck? Well, yeah. All aspects of your lives still controlled? Yeah, except this one thing, we got a little bit more freedom. That's not how you get to freedom, even if today you're allowed to do one little thing you weren't allowed to do yesterday. I know a lot of people desperately want to believe in a political solution, in a political savior who will fight for us. Obama will change things. Trump will change things. DeSantis will change things. But deep down inside, I think almost all of us know that isn't true. And to those still saying we just need to get back to following the Constitution, I feel your pain. I used to be one of you, and I remember trying to stamp down in my own mind the fact that I knew that was never, ever going to happen. I knew voting would never fix this. I knew working within the system had absolutely no chance of achieving freedom or anything close ever. And I knew that third parties and the entire political game would in the end accomplish exactly and precisely nothing. And this is when I was still a statist. But at the time, it's all I could think of to do, and I had to do something. I refused to give up the good fight, even when I knew deep down inside, to the depths of my soul, that the only recourse I could think of, political action, had absolutely no chance of success. None. I didn't want to acknowledge that there was zero chance of getting back to the Constitution, and even worse, didn't want to admit that the monstrosity we live with today is a direct result of the Constitution. Why would we try that again, as if that's even an option, when we already know the outcome? All right, I have to throw in this low blow here. What do constitutionalists and communists have in common? They're both constantly insisting the idea is great. It only turned into an authoritarian monstrosity because they didn't do it right. Now, if at this point you're feeling offended and defensive and angry or just hopeless and depressed, fear not, because despite what that may have seemed like, I am not saying that all is lost. Quite the opposite. I am very optimistic about the future of humanity in spite of all the ugly insanity we still have to go through to get to actual humanity. I'm not at all saying that the struggle for freedom is hopeless. Far from it. I am saying that trying to fight that fight within the system and mentality and paradigm that was created by power-happy sociopaths is never going to end well. The battle that matters now has nothing to do with any voting booth or legislation or political campaign or candidate or party. And the battle that really matters now is not even between the people and the government. The battle that matters now is between the consciences and moral judgments of billions of decent people and the insane anti-human mythology that they were all taught about government and authority. That is the only battlefield that matters. Because without us imagining them to have the right to rule, it all goes away. The problem is in between the ears of several billion people. The problem is not in Washington, D.C., neither is the solution. And not only do I not think the battle is hopeless, but I think the entire belief in government and political authority is utterly doomed, and a stateless society is absolutely inevitable. And that's why I titled this talk, When Statism Ends. Now, it certainly won't happen overnight. It's a slow and gradual process which has to happen one mind at a time, but it will happen, and it is happening. I know there will be some who will complain about things I've said here today, especially people on YouTube. There will be plenty of tantrums there, because they want all sorts of different pro-freedom individuals with different ideas and different focuses to join together for a common cause. But the reason I won't be singing Kumbaya quite yet, and the reason I will continue to harp on actual principles, is that everyone pushing for a political solution, everyone still supporting candidates and parties, even if they agree with me on certain issues and oppose authoritarianism in certain cases and oppose particular injustices, they all, every single one, want me forcibly robbed and coercively controlled in other ways. So, am I saying that I'm only on the side of people who will do things my way? On the issue of authoritarian coercion, yes. There are a million different ways to accomplish a million different things by way of mutual consent and voluntary organization and cooperation, and I have no objection to people trying any of those. But when someone says, we must stop the warmongering, but also everyone should be continually extorted to fund a welfare state, that person is still an enemy of humanity and an enemy of freedom, and therefore my enemy. And when someone else says, we shouldn't have a welfare state, and we must never allow government to disarm us, but also everyone has to be continually extorted to fund law enforcement and the courts and the military, those whose job it is to force the politician's will on the rest of us, that person is also anti-freedom. There is nothing genuinely pro-freedom about nitpicking over which things you want funded by widespread state coercion, or nitpicking about which peaceful choices and behaviors should be violently crushed by the state. If you personally advocate that I be robbed to fund whatever stuff you want government doing, then no. We're not on the same side, and we don't have a common cause. And of course, when I bash the authoritarian collectivism of the political left, the liberals all assume I must be right-wing. And when I bash the bogus authoritarian collectivist ideas of the political right, so-called conservatives assume I must be a leftist. Neither of them recognize that the left and the right have far more in common with each other than they do with me. They imagine themselves to be diametrically opposed, distant opposites, but they both accept the premise that a coercive ruling class should be robbing and controlling everyone. They disagree only about where the stolen loot should go and which aspects of life should be violently controlled by political parasites. Meanwhile, the fringe kook weirdo extremists like myself don't want anybody robbed to fund anything. We don't want anyone ruling any of you. If you're not committing force or fraud, we want you to have complete control of your own life, your own money, your own choices, etc. This is the only moral option. This is, by definition, the only option compatible with peaceful coexistence. You can't cheer for violent aggression and pretend you're peaceful. Right now, sadly, only a small percentage of the population of the world understands that. The good news is, pretty much the whole world is going to understand that, and it's going to happen a lot sooner than you might imagine. The question is, will you be one of those who fought for actual freedom, or will you be one of those who fought against it? Because anyone playing politics, anyone bickering over which flavor of authoritarian ruling class we should bow to is still an opponent of freedom. And somewhere down the road, maybe your grandchild will ask you, hey, Grandpa, back when you were still fighting over whether everyone should be dominated by a ruling class, before the last authoritarian empire fell, which side were you on? And by then, whether you were left or right isn't going to matter in the slightest. I mean, we pretend Stalin was left and Hitler was right. What's the stinking difference? Do we look back and go, hooray for those brave supporters of Mao or Stalin? No, you all cheered for evil and you all got evil. The particular flavor of authoritarian domination you cheered for will make no difference. All your grandkids will want to know is, were you on the side of statism or were you on the side of freedom? Because at the end of the day, those are the only two choices. You are either beholden to a master or you own yourself. There's no other choice and there's no in between. And regardless of which master you cheer for today, and regardless of your excuses for doing so, if you support government at all, you're still opposing freedom. Now, I've been talking as if some of you are my enemies, and on a practical sense, you kind of are. Why can't we all just get along? Well, if you're still advocating that I be forced to fund things I'm opposed to, you're why we can't get along. But I should point out that while your current beliefs may make you currently my enemy on a practical level, that doesn't mean you personally need to be my enemy. I know many thousands of people, a bunch of them are in the room today, who used to be my enemy on a practical level, and now they're not, because their beliefs changed and they no longer advocate authoritarian violence against me. In fact, I could say that the former me of many years ago, back when I still believed in the anti-human monster known as government, on a practical level, he would also have been an enemy of the current me. Luckily, he changed his whole perspective, and now we get along great. Now, I'm going to sound a bit presumptuous and condescending and say that a lot of people who hear this message, whether they're here or on YouTube, who today currently still believe in politics and government, in the near future are going to change their minds. It's not because they will decide to defer to my beliefs and values. Why the hell should they do that? But because they figure out that the belief in government is already not at all compatible with their own fundamental beliefs and values. It's not going to be everyone who hears this, and it'll probably be a slow and uncomfortable process for a lot of people, as it was for me. But afterwards, that person and myself, we're no longer at odds with each other. Not because they changed who they fundamentally are or what they fundamentally believe, but because they will have given up the lie of authority, which has been tricking them into supporting things that don't match who they really are. And then they and myself and lots of other people will actually be able to peacefully coexist, even if we have different interests and different priorities and different values and different backgrounds and different goals and different lifestyles and everything else. Because neither of us will be asking government to rob and control the other one. And that is the only thing we need in common in order to peacefully coexist. The only thing. So, if you're still clinging to some form of statism or other, if you still think that it's legitimate and necessary and righteous, then by all means, find me maybe up at my rock where I'll be for the rest of today and tomorrow. And I'd love to hear your argument for why you should have less freedom than what I want you to have. Thank you.